Flu-like symptoms, delirium, possible OD by Ditchweed Danny. I had my first, possibly my last nutmeg trip a few weeks after my first experience with cannabis. I had read many reports on nutmeg and many sources such as Anarchist Cookbook and licit and illicit drugs, stated as being a hallucinogen. But it wasn't until my friend M told me that he had tried it firsthand that I decided to give it a whirl. M said he had bought 2 whole nutmegs and ground them up with yogurt and decided the effects quite vaguely as being blurred out, which I took to mean as stoned. For a bit of background information, I'm 17, I live and work in the States, and I'm a high school graduate. My only other encounters with drugs have been pills, Effexor and Tamzadipan, alcohol, and at that time, one encounter with pot. I wanted to try mushrooms and LSD, if they still make it, for the longest time, but I've sadly never had the chance. On to the experience. I'd wanted to buy a little more weed, but the buddy who sold it to me wasn't answering the phone. So I decided now was a good time as any to go on a nutmeg trip as my mom and her boyfriend were at the bar and wouldn't be home for hours. I had bought a jar of nutmeg from Eddie's Grocery and brought it home at about 3 o'clock a.m. I emptied half the jar into some plain, unflavored yogurt, just as my buddy M had done, and ate the whole mess as fast as I could. The taste was tolerable, but it was still nutmeg. I knew the effects took a while to come on, so I hadn't done much but watch TV and surf the web. I was relaxed. My expectations for this trip were hallucinations, religious visions, CEVs, and so forth. As I had thought nutmeg was a psychedelic, I was wrong. At around 6 p.m., I started feeling dull, not stoned or drunk, but just blunt and spaced out, sort of like a strong nicotine buzz. It was not pleasant. I laid down in bed and stared at the ceiling, closed my eyes, and looked for geometric patterns. I saw nothing. I just lied there as the feeling of turning to wood got more and more intense. I felt lethargic and unable to move. I knew the drug was beginning to take its terrible effect. Suddenly, my mobile rang. It was startling, and I was afraid it might be work asking me to come in. Something I was not in the right condition for. It turned out to be my friend B, asking if I wanted some weed. I told him I totally loved some, hoping it would get me out of my nutmeg-induced hell. He said I'd have to come over to the pub and socialize a bit, and he'd give me a little homegrown. I put on my clothes, and suddenly, like the floodgates had been opened, I was more stoned than I had ever been in my life. I felt depersonalized as though I had a wet towel wrapped around my head. I knew I couldn't meet B for the pot, because if I had to go to the pub and socialize, I would probably be committed right now. I called back B and told him that I thought I'd come down with the flu. When I hung up the phone, I wasn't sure if I really had talked to him. I checked my calls log to make sure. At this point in time, I was pretty sure I hadn't even reached the plateau of the nutmeg yet, and I wasn't liking the come up too much. I ran to the bathroom trying to puke it up, which seemed like a good idea. I stuck my fingers down my throat, retched and gagged, but nothing came up. I knew I had no chance but to, as I had phrased in my mind, right then and there, ride this strange torpedo out to the end. I didn't know anything about bad trips or bad highs. If I had known then what I know now, I would have put on some music and sat down until I was calm. I would have just went with it instead of hoping it would be over soon. Instead, kept pacing around my room with an intense feeling of nervousness and anxiety that I couldn't shake off. At this point, I don't know the time, I didn't know much of anything at that moment. I decided it would be best to sleep things off, and that's when things really got bad. My eyes were red as hell and made a scratching sound when I blinked. My mouth was beyond cottonmouth. It was as though my tongue was made of wax paper and my saliva glands had gone on strike. Even holding water in my mouth didn't provide relief from this feeling. Falling asleep was made more difficult by a feeling that I was unable to breathe unless I concentrated on it. Every time my mind wandered, I felt like I was suffocating. Emotionally, I was very depressed. I felt like a failure. Every screw-up and disappointment of my life had come into a parade around my bed. Finally, at midnight, my mom and her boyfriend had gotten home. She was drunk and almost in bad as shape as I was. She said she had run into B at the pub and he told her I was sick, which I confirmed. Her voice sounded distorted, like she was speaking from far away, and I could just barely remember what she said. I went to sleep briefly and woke up at 3 a.m., only to realize to my horror that I was still just as stoned as I had been. At this point, I had my first and only real visual hallucination. I looked at my hands and they were outlined in the darkness with some sort of green electric energy pattern. This effect disappeared when I moved my hands. I got back to sleep after some momentary worry about when this would be over. I woke up the next morning still buzzed, but it wasn't as noticeable. I didn't have to go into work that day. I felt nauseous and picked up the bucket next to my bed, which I didn't remember bringing in, but I knew it was there, and puked up, to my surprise, pure, raw, brown nutmeg. Probably about as much as I had eaten. For pretty much the whole day, I stayed in bed until about 4 in the afternoon. I had told my mom I had the flu and felt tired. She let me rest. For the next 2 days, I still felt out there, but a lot less tired and a little more focused. I know there are some people who like nutmeg and think it's a drug meant solely for themselves. I don't doubt that it works for them. I am pretty sure I overdosed, and that's what caused my bad time. If I do try nutmeg again, I would probably only ingest 10 to 15 grams, but I don't think I'll try it again for a long, long time. Frightening to say the least, by N.A. I heard about nutmeg through the grapevine, and I have to admit that I was curious to use it. It seemed that the worst side effects were just nausea and things like that, and it seemed relatively safe considering that it's something that it's in almost everyone's spice rack. How could something that my mother puts in her pumpkin pie hurt me seriously? I decided to try it, even though my only experience with anything mind-altering had involved alcohol. I took whole nutmegs and ground them up into a powder in a coffee grinder. I proceeded to have it with iced tea. I have tried nutmeg on 2 occasions. The first time was relatively small dose and was fairly unremarkable other than the fact that the nutmeg tasted horrible, and I felt like I had to vomit whenever I put it in my mouth. I will admit that for a day or 2 afterwards I felt slower in thinking and I felt fairly calm and happy, but it wasn't anything to write home about. The second time is what changed my life. I took about 2 tablespoons on a Tuesday night at around 10 or 11 p.m. This time it seemed like it wasn't as nauseous when I ate the nutmeg this time, which was good. At around 2 or 3 a.m. I could feel my energy going up despite the fact that I had been awake for so long. I'd woken up early in the morning, and I even proceeded to start a heated debate with my mother at about 3 a.m. I felt warm all over, and I felt rather agitated and aggressive, yet very energetic. I did not want to go to bed, but I did. On Wednesday morning, I woke up after about 4 hours of sleep, got out of bed, and walked to my bathroom to take a shower as usual. My head felt a little heavy and I felt a bit out of it, but I assumed that was because of the lack of sleep. I practically had forgotten that I had taken the nutmeg the night before. I was in the shower for about 2 or 3 minutes when all of a sudden my head started to feel very heavy. Everything around me started moving in slow motion, and although I was standing still, the room felt like it was shaking. I could hardly see, and I felt that a very bright light was being shone straight into my eyes, and my hearing started to diminish, instead replaced with a very loud static noise in my ear, like I was standing right next to a TV with very bad reception. I don't remember much, but I do remember that I sat down in my shower for what felt like a few seconds. I'm not sure how long it actually was, but it was probably no longer than a minute. And then I proceeded, despite my lack of senses and my extreme dizziness, to try to step out of my shower. I had 1 foot out of the shower when I just lost control and fell straight onto the bathroom floor. I was lucky that I didn't fall flat on my face and broken my nose, bruised my face, etc. I later found out that I somehow got from my bathroom onto my bed and started screaming for my mother. I have no recollection of my supposed journey to my bed. My mom came and told me to calm down because I was slowly starting to panic. My skin was starting to get cold and clammy, and I was starting to sweat. What scared me the most was the fact that it was so difficult to breathe. I could literally feel my heart slowing down, and I was probably taking only a few breaths a minute. I thought I was either having a heart attack or going into shock. Thankfully, neither of those things actually happened. After my mother threw water in my face, held my hand, and told me to calm down and not to panic, I started to feel better, and my breathing started becoming more normal, and after several spoonfuls of salt, my blood pressure was back to normal. I felt tired and fatigued, so I fell asleep. This was around 8 a.m. While I was sleeping, several times I was half asleep, half awake, and during those times I could hear my phone ringing. From the sound of it, it sounded like I had 10 missed calls because I could hear my phone ringing over and over again, although when I actually looked, I only had 2 missed calls. Also, we had workers coming into our home that day, and I heard them ring the doorbell, although it sounded like they had rang it about 10 times as well. I later realized that these were auditory hallucinations. It felt as if my head would record a sound, such as the ring of my doorbell or the ring of my phone, and it would keep on playing it on repeat in my head. Anyways, I woke up at around 12:30 p.m. and had to use the restroom. I got out of bed and felt alright, so I proceeded to my bathroom, did my business, and as I was getting up from the commode, I started to hear familiar static sound in my ears, and all of a sudden the room got bright and faint in my eyes. I fainted again, and although I don't remember much, I do remember trying to get up, but I had no control over my muscles. It felt like they had a mind of their own, so whenever I tried to get up, my body would just fling itself in the opposite direction. I had totally lost control of my body. I called for my mother again, and she ran upstairs, and we yet again went through the same experience that I had gone through earlier that morning. Very slow breathing rate, drop of blood pressure, sweating, sense of doom, etc. I will admit that this time it was not as bad, probably because I was not as frightened. Unfortunately, this experience made me realize that I was unable to stand up or even sit up at all without passing out after about 30 seconds to 1 minute. It was as if the nutmeg had made my veins so loose that when I stood up, my brain just couldn't hold on to the blood that was there. For the whole day, I had to stay lying down, preferably with my eyes closed. If I wanted to move, I had to crawl very slowly. I had to constantly remain horizontal. I could not bring my head up vertically, and I had to stop every few seconds to lay down and bring some of the blood back to my brain. During the day, my overall vision was acting as if I had drank heavily the night before. Vision moving around and shaking despite actually standing still. Colors seemed brighter, and occasionally I would see odd shapes. I felt pretty out of it mentally. I had bad short-term memory, and I felt disconnected, yet connected to everything around me. Overall, I felt like I was in a dream, some sort of alternate reality. The feelings are kind of indescribable. I continued feeling fatigue and sleeping, and I could also tell that I was retaining water. Even though I was drinking very large amounts of water with sugar, I urinated only twice that day. I also had stomach cramps and various pains in my lower abdomen especially. On Thursday, I decided to go to school for half of the day. I felt a lot better, and I even took a shower on my own. Although I moved slowly and kept the door on the bathroom open, so my mom could hear me easily if I called for help, all was well, and I felt pretty good. Only slightly off-center, kind of like after having about 3 drinks. I went to school and immediately was surrounded by my friends in the rather warm and loud cafeteria. I was very much frightened again about passing out because it suddenly felt like the people around me were shaking slightly, and I got dizzy whenever I turned my head to look in a different direction. I went to lay down in the library and I took a short nap, which made me feel much better. My mind was still not working very well for the remainder of the day. I felt very slow and kind of tipsy. At about 3 p.m. I started feeling like I was getting worse, and people seemed very odd from my perspective, and I almost felt like I was hallucinating everything around me. I'm not sure if some of it was hallucinations. I remember looking at a picture of someone skydiving, and I could close my eyes and feel like I was actually jumping out of the plane and quickly falling towards the ground. It was not a hallucination, but more like a very vivid dream. I took another brief nap, and I actually felt as good as new once I woke up. Colors weren't as bright and odd looking, and people were not quite as frightening and suspicious anymore. For the remainder of the day, I felt calm, happy, and more like what a nutmeg high should be like. I felt that way for a few hours, and once it got around dinner time, I started feeling withdrawal symptoms such as depression, sadness, and loneliness. The same withdrawal symptoms I have when I drink alcohol. Overall, nutmeg was definitely not worth it, and it should not be underestimated. It is very powerful, especially considering the fairly small amount that I took. Please just stay away from nutmeg. The Little Tripper Who Couldn't, by Marquis. When I began abusing nutmeg, I was going through a very rough patch in my life. I was very depressed, and my abuse of this terrible spice only served to make things worse. Around April of 2002, I learned that nutmeg could be used to get high. I was only 15 at the time, and quite frankly, all I cared about was getting high. I drank and smoked hash quite frequently. A week or two after I learned about it, I decided to give it a shot and took a tub of the demon spice from my kitchen one night. I dosed it about 8 p.m. that night, taking about 15 grams. I was awake until around 11 p.m., and by that time I decided that nothing was going to happen and went to sleep. I woke the next morning for school in a complete haze. I was overwhelmingly stoned. I had a terrible dry mouth, my eyes so bloodshot that they were barely open, and the body load was so heavy that I had a hell of a time getting ready for school. I managed somehow. At school, I just sat around feeling fantastic. I was on exactly the same high as I get from my favorite plant, weed, and I was more stoned than I had ever been. My schoolmates all commented on how out of it I looked, but I was unable to respond because the dry mouth was so bad that I couldn't form a sentence. The next day I was a little groggy, yet I still felt great. Here I was, having discovered something that was good as weed. Hell, it was better than weed. I could get incredibly stoned for 2 days straight, and all for the low price of $1.99. I was on top of the world. And thus it continued. I soon fell into a regular pattern of nutmeg use, as often as 3 times a week, but more usually once every week or two. Sometimes I would drink a bottle of wine while I dosed, so that by the time the wine would wear off, I'd be buzzing off the meg, as happy as could be without a care in the world, or I'd smoke a few joints while I was peaking to allow for an even better experience. I spent the entire summer in this pattern. My method of ingestion was not as bad as how other people seemed to do it. Rather than use the pre-powdered nutmeg, I would buy a packet of whole ones and crush them up in a mortar and pestle until they became small nutmeg chunks. Washing these down with water left no horrible taste and none of that nutmeg clinging to back a throat feeling. As for the buzz, this is what it was for me. I just felt incredibly stoned. It was almost exactly the same as a cannabis high, only more euphoric. Music was particularly excellent, and Pink Floyd and Bob Marley would bring me to a state of ecstasy. I also found it a lot easier to get absorbed in anything I was reading. I guess it aided my ability to create mental imagery. Having read accounts online, I would have expected this to be a little more trippy, but the only hallucination I ever experienced in nutmeg was this. Sitting watching TV as I came up one night, the sound from the TV faded away, and I was suddenly listening to Michael Jackson's Black or White. This only lasted for a few seconds, and then it was gone. On that particular night, I had been trying out a new brand of nutmeg, and I had estimated my dose to be 20 grams. It was actually less than that, though. This is something to note. I have found that the potency of nutmeg from different sources varies vastly, and I learned that this is the hard way that night. After a few hours of TV, when I had pretty much just come up, I felt extremely sleepy. Unusual for me to get so tired so early, and decided to go to bed, and off I went. I woke at 5 a.m. after only 4 hours of sleep. At first I didn't realize I was awake. In fact, I didn't even realize who I was. All I knew was that face that was floating around amidst the stars of the ceiling of my bedroom was awfully close, only inches away. I wondered how the ceiling had gotten so close to my bed. It seemed to be getting closer. I lay there confused for a few seconds. Something's not right, I think to myself. What could it be? Hang on. Is it? Yes. That's it. I'm not breathing. That's what's wrong. Gasp. Okay, we sorted out that problem anyway. Now where'd the face from the ceiling go? He must be around here somewhere. Wait, there it is again. Why aren't I breathing? Gasp. This is odd. Normally breathing just happens by itself. Here, did the ceiling just get closer? I think it's trying to kill me. It's trying to suffocate me. Oh no. Gasp! That can't be it. Carbon dioxide. That's what it is. The room's filled up with carbon dioxide, and that's why I can't breathe. I've got to move. I gotta get out of here. I black out. I stop breathing. Gasp. What? Where am I? Why is it nighttime? Oh yes, that's it. I'm in bed. But why aren't I breathing? Gasp. This is starting to scare me. Why can't I feel my left arm? Why is my heart beating so fast? Gasp. What does that guy in the ceiling want? I can't feel my face. What did he do to my face? Gasp. I ought to get out of here. It's the carbon dioxide. It has to be. I'll just get up and go get some fresh air and I'll be okay. Gasp. Oh no. I get up. My heart will explode. My legs feel swollen and it's all numb. One of my arteries must have burst. And now my leg is filling up with blood. I'm going to die. Gasp. What do I do? What do I do? If I stay here, I'll die. And if I get up, I'll die too. What do I do? Gasp. Wait, think about this. How did you get here? Gasp. Nutmeg. That was it. I took nutmeg last night. I've OD'd on nutmeg. I'm going to die. I can't feel my face. I can't breathe. I've got to get out of here. I black out. I stop breathing. I awaken with a gasp. And the cycle begins all over again. Suffice to say, I spent a good 3 hours lying in bed, gasping for breath every so often and occasionally blacking out. I was too terrified to move. I stopped hallucinating, but I was delusional. I was convinced that an artery in my leg had burst as a result of extremely high blood pressure. I was absolutely certain that I had given myself severe nerve damage from the nutmeg, and hence the numbness in my face and limbs. I eventually calmed down myself a little and plucked up the courage to go downstairs and tell my mother of what had happened and that I was certain that I was dying. She called an ambulance. I spent several hours lying in an emergency room bed. I was then moved up to a ward which was filled with old men who had to use catheter tubes. The hospital staff wanted to hook me up to one. Not pleasant. I didn't come down fully until about 3 days later. One thing lasted, though. The left side of my face and my left arm and leg were still partially numb. I could sense temperature and pain, but not pressure. Strange, huh? To this day, I still don't know for sure if the nutmeg actually caused me nerve damage or if it's somehow all in my head, but I remain convinced. While it is not as bad as it was when I first got landed in the hospital, I still can't feel pressure properly. Since this experience with nutmeg, I can no longer smoke hash and enjoy it. I associate the buzz with meg too much. The first few times I smoked up after I was in the hospital, I freak out bad because, well, I was so aware of my lack of sensation in my face and limbs. It was exactly like being back in that bed, unable to move. Nowadays, when I do smoke, very rarely, I don't usually enjoy myself, as I just get slightly depressed, but that's all. I also went, to put it one way, a little crazy after this experience. In addition to bouts of horrible anxiety lasting for days and loads more depression, my thought patterns just became odd. Very odd. Sometimes my train of thought would skip from one thing to another without any logical connection, etc. This whole ordeal has been the most unpleasant experience of my life.